comes. Exit stage right.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you very much. And I'd just like to make a couple of opening comments before I start my formal presentation. The first is that in an agenda that is so tightly packed with a handful of presentation opportunities at the premier event, one of the premier events of Food SA, I would just like to express my appreciation that I've been given the opportunity to be one of those speakers. So I wanted to acknowledge that. And secondly, I'm getting away from Catherine Pullman and the whole Food SA to have turned this around in the timeframe that they have, notwithstanding there are challenges with technology all the time, is also an amazing outcome. So I just wanted to flag that because I'll probably forget it at the end. And the last thing I'd just like to say is I'm packing a lot of information into a small period of time, so I would just ask perhaps that any questions be held to the end, and I'm happy to deal with whatever I possibly can in that 5-minute window that I have for questions. And secondly, more than happy to take any questions offline should anyone want to do that. So I just want to start by referring to my brand topic. Oops, I've gone the wrong way. It's already up there. My apologies. Building and sustaining a strong company brand. And I just want to emphasise that my conversation and my presentation is about company value. There's a lot of discussion that goes on, and very important discussion that goes on in relation to product brands, but very rarely does the discussion of looking at a company performance through brand lens occur at the board table or at the executive table. And I've been following this for a lot of years, and it's an issue that I've been very passionate about changing mindsets around this. And I've determined my own little acronym for COVID, which stands for Creating Outstanding Value for Our Industry Deliberately. So perhaps you might want to write that down and take the glass half full version of COVID rather than the other side. So let me just set the scene by referring back to a presentation I did some 18 months ago to a CFO symposium. In fact, it was here at this beautiful Adelaide Oval venue. And it was me, this branding guy on stage with 250 hard-headed CFOs in the audience. And I posed some questions as I started that conversation. And I said, I want you to park these questions in your thinking, and I'd ask anyone who's listening to this today to perhaps ask yourself this question as well. And that is, why is it that we call brands intangible assets? I think we all appreciate the terminology intangible. Why do we call them intangible assets? I want to challenge that in my presentation today, and I would hope that I can shift some thinking around some of this. The second question I posed was, why is it that the goodwill of a company, which I will refer to today as reputational value, why does that not appear on the balance sheet? And the answer I get is because you don't know what that's worth until you sell the company. And to some degree, I accept the proposition that you can't determine the actual figure. But there are methodologies, there are frameworks you can use to determine whether you are actively and deliberately engaging in the development of reputational value. And let me describe reputational value. Reputational value is what gives a brand a value well past the accountant's version of multiples of EBIT. It's when people pay a premium for a brand over and above what the numbers tell you. Because really, if you look at the performance of a business, I would argue strongly that the numbers are really only the result of how well that business is managed and led in the first place. And a brand at a company level is no different. So let me just share some insights into valuations. You've already seen some numbers today around the value of brands. And so I just want to pose, I don't know how I'll receive your answers here, but I'm going to pose a question to the audience. And that is to help me understand, whether you know what the number one brand in the world is right now. It's not food specific. What's the number one brand in the world right now? And I'll have to keep moving because I've never quite done it like this before. The number one brand in the world is Apple. What do you think Apple is worth? The reputational value of Apple as a brand. What do you think it's worth? If anyone here wants to have a go, you're welcome to. $234 billion. This is a valuation undertaken by Interbrand. There are 3 major valuation companies in the world. And Interbrand, in my view, because I follow these numbers very carefully, Interbrand, in my view, is tied back to a firm that I like to look at the numbers because I've correlated the valuations that they've created over the years compared to years when those companies were sold, so that I could compare the numbers they came up with to the numbers that were being presented. And ultimately, your value is what the market is prepared to pay. So what I want to focus on today is building reputational value in your brand, building that premium value over and above the multiples of EBIT. And the number 100 brand in the world is Prada at 4.8 billion in this shift. So what I then did was had a look specifically at the food and beverage brands that appear in the top 100 brands in the world. And just remember that there are millions of brands in the world. This is the top 100 brands by reputational value. So I'll put that slide up. You can see that there are a lot of brands. I suspect there wouldn't be too many brands there, or if any, that you don't know. Ironically, number 79 is Corona. So it perhaps hasn't affected it as much as we think, but Corona is in that list, which was a bit ironical. I wanted then to show you the value of food and beverage brands in terms of there are 14 out of the top 100 brands in the world, and it takes a lot to be the top 100 in the world. And its collective value, its consolidated value is $235.4 billion, or 11% of the consolidated value of all the top 100 brands' reputational value. So in anyone's terms, I would argue that level of representation says to me very clearly that the food and beverage market and food and beverage producers have a real opportunity to drive reputational value. It's proven by the brands that appear in that list. And the argument that, oh, they're big brands, we're small brands, you know, you can become a big brand. So all big brands are small brands at some stage, and you've got to grow that potential, but you've got to do it deliberately. And I want to share with you today how that's possible, how we can make that happen rather than just talk about the theories around it. So that's that combination of theory and pragmatism. So another slide that I use, which joins the dots on what I'm trying to say, is a study that was done by McKinsey, a large international consulting group that you probably know. They also undertook through their own metrics, and I don't have the time to go through all that detail, to understand what they felt the reputational portion of a total company value was in the business-to-consumer market and what they thought it was in the business-to-business market. And their metrics unveiled that they believe that a really strong brand, its reputational value would be 53% of the total company value and 30% for business-to-business. My view is that the business-to-business number is probably understated because it's very hard to measure relationship strength. Whereas in the business-to-consumer market, you've got some wider, more obvious metrics that can be covered. But however you cut and dice this, at the end of the day, you cannot argue that your brand and protecting your brand and growing the reputation of your brand must be one of the most important asset discussions you have as an executive and as a board in your organisation. And I'll say to you absolutely unequivocally, until more recent years, I've been just as guilty as anybody else sitting around a table not having enough of a discussion around this stuff. But I know how important it is, and I ask you, is there any other asset in your organisation that is worth that proportionality? And if you can agree to some degree with the numbers I'm putting up here, ask yourself, how often do you discuss company as a brand and how it can drive value? And we've heard about some issues around value today, or potential to create value in a product level basis, which is very, very important. But when you look at a company through a brand lens, you start to see a whole lot of more value creation, and I'll show you and demonstrate that in a moment. So let me just share this graph. Justin made the comment, don't kill your brand, don't do silly things during COVID. This is a graph that, it was ironical, he and I have not conferred in any way, other than in the gym or whatever Amanda was saying. This shows the things that created shareholder loss during the GFC. So I'm translating his words of advice, which were very pertinent, into some real numbers to show you what actually happened. And during the GFC period, there were three categories that caused loss. And when I say loss, it's not just the immediate loss of shareholding, it's the decisions that are made under panic that then have long-term detrimental effect on your brand. And I'll just share these very, very rapidly with you. 6% is financial. Financial were things like hedging bets. Just getting the hedging wrong so you lose a bit of money. But generally speaking, in well-run companies, finances and operations have been the two more mature functional areas, and branding or marketing, branding and the human resource side have followed behind. So financial control is usually pretty good, but sometimes being overly financial can damage the thinking you have to do to create really powerful brands. 31% is operational. So if we take it in the context of a piece of equipment, a capital expenditure request is made to your board. That says we're going to produce our cakes 5 times faster. And when we do all the numbers, it's going to be a 2-year payback, and then we'll be so far in front it's not funny. And then the panic moment hits and we stop doing everything else that we need to do. We stop thinking about how we feed into that piece of equipment. We stop thinking about how we feed out of that piece of equipment. And suddenly its capacity is limited to 30% and you don't realise the return. So that's a shareholder loss. It may not be an immediate number, but it is still a loss in comparison to what the business had intended to do. So, with that sort of background and understanding the strength that a brand can drive, the fundamental question, I think, in the way that I would ask it to a board, or what I would ask you as a board, if you were my board, is this question. And that is it worthy, and perhaps this question might be better answered once I've finished the rest of my presentation, but I want to ask it up front now, because it's decisions that boards are making without perhaps some of the insights I hope I'll share that will be of some value to you. And that is, as a board and executive, is it worthy to place more time and attention at a company level to driving a strategy that makes customers insist on your company by name? Let me share a very embarrassing part of my history. When I was appointed head of Schweppes in South Australia, and Schweppes had just won the licensing rights for Pepsi. And I went to a race meeting at Morphettville, which is in Adelaide for those who don't know Morphettville, which we sponsored as a major sponsor. And I had my managing director standing alongside of me, and the first thing I went to the bar and they asked for a drink, I said, I'll have a bourbon and Coke, thanks. And my managing director just looked at me, and then the person at the bar, as if that wasn't bad enough, because we were competing directly against Coke, as if that wasn't bad enough, when the person said they only have Pepsi, I said, I'll have a beer, thanks. And I had the managing director. So it wasn't deliberate, it wasn't smart, it was just how strong your mind is attached to brands. And I could share a million examples over my lifetime of how you can remove a name from a brand and no one has a preference, you put the name on and it completely changes their view. That's what's insisting on your company by name stands for. And so my question to the audience is, do we have the need to look at this? And can we build a strategy that makes that happen? And if we limit our thinking to our products and services, we will never find the vast opportunities to create value well beyond product that drives the value of our company brand. And so I want to share with you as a group a framework that we use with businesses. And I'm genuinely not here to sell anything to anyone. I just want to share this framework with you because there was a question asked a couple earlier about what do we do with all this information? How do we work through it? And I think that's an exceptionally powerful question because we do get inundated with tons and tons of information. Quite seriously, we can disappear up you know where with too much complexity. So this framework is, if I put it into context, is if we put up our hand and said, we are the brand, we are entering the awards that are about a brand that makes people insist on our company name, and we've entered these awards. And like a Telstra award, if you've ever entered a Telstra Business Award, there is a set of criteria that is utilised to determine whether what you're saying is, or how real what you're saying is or isn't. And I want to share this framework with you because this is the framework in a modified way that we've done, which deals with how major valuation companies measure the value that you're creating outside of your EBIT to profit. So what is your reputational value? And it is measurable, and this is the point I'm trying to make. But it's not measurable with an immediate number. What you're looking at is how can the business know that it is driving reputation effectively and strategically? So it's an easy thing for me to say. I want to share how to do it because I think that's far more pragmatic and far more valuable. So the drivers that measurement companies use and that we use with businesses have got two sets, internal and external drivers. And I need to push through these pretty quickly, but I need to also flag to you that every one of these drivers has a series of probably 5 or 6 deep-reaching questions that enables anyone, including the internal business, which is who should really be doing it, to open up an assessment of where they are against the key drivers that are ensuring that your business is driving and creating value and creating reputational value. That value is very worth pursuing. So let me just deal with them pretty rapidly, and I will pick a couple and expand on them a little bit to give you a bit more context. Clarity, we heard the research point about really understanding where your customers are. And this clarity of a brand doesn't stay still. And COVID has rapidly changed a lot of our requirements, and we need to be across what that all means. And so this is about knowing where you sit as a company brand, knowing who you're trying to serve, where you're playing with your brand, and understanding what drives the energy of that market and to want to engage with you and to want to call you an awesome company to deal with. If you don't understand that, how can you possibly ever tell me that you've done it? Many companies tell me, yeah, we know all this, and when you break it down, it's quite shallow, and I don't mean that disrespectfully, I'm just stating what I've seen in my travels. The second one is commitment. Commitment is not just about saying we've got our new brand approach, this is the new company's position, we've told everyone and everyone's excited. Commitment is much deeper reaching that when you think of it at a company level, and I'm going to show a diagram, demonstrate this via a diagram in a moment that will give it much more context than just that. But the question is, how do I activate everybody within my organisation to be able to understand what activities they undertake that will drive the brand outcomes that we're looking for, the reputation that we're looking for as an organisation? I don't know how many times in my career I would like a dollar for every time someone's talked to me about our departments are solo-minded, they don't work together, finance hates marketing, blah, 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 all that sort of talk. It doesn't need to exist. A brand is the filter that enables the company to bring together common purpose. Protection and responsiveness. I don't think it's a big revelation to anybody that in today's world, whilst we've got the digital world and it allows us to do a lot of things, it also creates significantly more challenges when it comes to reputation of our brand. And I just ask you to consider what is your program to protect your brand? How do you do it? Who covers it? Who looks at it? And how well across are we across it in the first place? And responsiveness is the research question from an internal point of view. So there's this inside looking out. From an internal point of view, we're saying, are we proactive? And I think one of our previous speakers used that terminology. Are we proactive in constantly keeping our finger on the pulse of what's driving this market? And COVID is a black swan event, but I would argue that this is a practice and a discipline that should exist irrespective of being in COVID or not, because markets shift and markets change. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. So then we move into external drivers. And I think Amanda used the word authenticity. And I'm putting authenticity and consistency together. You know, somebody made a statement to me, I think it was in Sydney, which really resonated with me, and that was, you can lie about a brand, but a brand won't lie. So you can say whatever you like, but you have to live it, you have to deliver it for it to be authentic. And if you think of any of those top 100 brands that you quickly looked at, even the food and beverage brands, I would guarantee you there's a lot of capability in that brand that makes it happen. You don't just get there, you have to drive it deliberately. And consistency is how often that authenticity is experienced by the markets we're trying to serve. So I can be authentic, but am I consistently driving that agenda and making it happen? And as I said, I'll share an example of this with you in a moment. The next part, these two I want to pay particular attention to. Relevance and differentiation. I don't know how many times I've been brought into a program to look at a product that was differentiated, but it had no relevance to the market, and the amount of investment that gets wasted in not thinking this through enough. But the most important point I want to make in such a short time about these two is that there's an absolute financial correlation between those two dynamics being at play in your organisation, truly at play, to the future prediction of reputational value and brand value. There's a very strong correlation when you look at the way the major companies measure this, that if those two are truly alive in an effective manner within your business, you can be very confident there will be a correlation with improved profitability and brand value in the future. So I would argue very strongly wherever you can to look at this. But when we talk about relevance and particularly differentiation, and I expand on commitment, I want to show you how you can build many more opportunities rather than just product opportunities. And then last two are presence and understanding. Presence is a conscious decision about where you want to play, how visible you want to be across any medium in terms of what your customers say. But is it something, and the best way I can describe it in very pragmatic terms is when we talk about, we get a lot of word of mouth business. And I'm sure many of you would have heard this. My question back is, do we proactively have a strategy that leverages the proactive support for our brand, or does it just happen? Does it happen passively, or do we absolutely proactively drive that agenda? And when you look at it through that lens, I guarantee you, if you're not doing it now, you'll find lots of opportunities that are already in your company that don't cost more money. They just need to be found and they need to be leveraged. And understanding is about making core decisions that do we want the company to be just a name? Do we want to put people behind the brand that have passion for their company? There's a lot of Apple, Steve Jobs. There's lots of scenarios where you've got people who are passionate about what they do, and that passion becomes an engaging component of reputational brand value. You don't have to do that as a business, it's a choice. But if you have that opportunity, perhaps rather than keep your passion within your four walls, you might want to express it. And I think most people who know South Australian companies will be aware of at least one company, and I won't mention names, that sold about 3 years ago for less than half its share at a multiple 15 times larger than the multiple that would typically be applied to EBIT in a food industry, and that was all reputationally based. So I'm happy to take an argument that you can't build reputation deliberately. I'm very happy to have that discussion with anyone at any time because I know you can. So if you imagine now, how do we take this into a measurable scenario? Because I think the lack of applying a value to goodwill or reputational value, calling brands intangible assets, is because people don't know, those that say that don't know how to measure it. This framework is about measuring your success as you build reputation. And if you imagine, going back to what I said earlier, the 5 or so questions that drill down on every one of those dimensions, we then measure that, and what happens at a board level is you get that. You get a chart that shows you how important those drivers are to building your reputation now that you've got clear understanding of what they mean. And there's an internal and external measurement, so internal and market measurement of how well we're performing against each of those drivers. And given the specific questions that are asked, it also gives you very clear insights. It also gives you very clear insights as to what it is you have to do to drive the agenda. So please, I always say to someone, don't ever come to me and say, you can't measure brand. Brands are intangible. It's just nonsense. We want to believe it, and because if we believe it, it doesn't appear where it needs to appear. On the board table, it doesn't get the share of voice that it needs to get. So now I want to just talk about making this happen in your organisation. So let's look at commitment. There's one that I wanted to pick out in particular, and I want to share a diagram with you, and I hope this is going to be easy enough to see for you. One of the reasons I think brand doesn't get the attention that it should, particularly at a company level, is because it's often treated as a marketing issue. When we talk about brand, yep, our marketing department is looking at all this, they're working through it all, and they're doing some great communications and so on. And those things are vital to brand strength, but they're only one contributor to brand strength. And I'd like to share a different version of that diagram, which goes something like this. And that is that brand strategy should be wrapped around your business strategy. And if, for example, the word innovation, NPD, innovation was thrown up earlier. If you imagine wrapping innovation around around business strategy for a moment, and let me pose these questions, just some immediate questions that come to mind for me. Would it change the sort of people you recruit in your company? Do you have a recruitment process that actually deals with bringing innovation into your company? Should you be pursuing third-party relationships with universities or other parties that are conducting research that are relevant to your food product and your business, and start engaging them with them on a relationship basis that accelerates the capability around MPD and the capability around innovation. It's not locked into your four walls. So if you look at it through that lens, that would be typically considered as a human resources issue. It's not a marketing issue, but it is a branding issue. Okay? It is a branding issue. So from that perspective, I want to share a couple of examples with you, real-life examples. This is a business that we've worked with who is a producer of fresh produce. This producer was approached by one of the major chains, and almost essentially a $2 million order was put on the table because he was producing a product that the market recognised as being significantly fresh, not fresher but crisper, but because there was a lot less water use through extrusion process. And the reason for that was that a lot of his business was manually based. So this was a small, medium business, manually based operations, clearly with the right HACCP controls and everything else. And so he had this dollar value on the table. Go back to Justin's point. There was an opportunity for a sale. And it was so easy that you could smell it that you wanted to take it. And his first response to that was to look at his operations area and to determine what it is that he needed to do to be able to meet the capacity that couldn't be done in the manual process. And no surprise, he ended up looking at equipment that was no different to his major eastern border competitors. But still at this stage buoyed by the excitement of a big sale. Then we sat down and talked about it with a brand lens. We said, let's think, this business has come to you because of the reputation of your product. And the strategy you're proposing to get the sale is in essence a strategy to eliminate the very advantage that you have, which is that reputational advantage. Why would you do that? And this is where sometimes panic, the checks in front of me, doesn't cause us to think clearly about the longer term damage to our brand by doing something like that. To his credit, he didn't do it. And I respect him to this day that he didn't do it, because I'm not quite sure if it was the reverse what I would have done ultimately without the knowledge, okay? And what he did was he invested $1 million and received a $1 million grant to develop a piece of equipment that replicated hand movement to about the 80th percentile. So he was then able to automate his production process, not at the same level of quality that it was, but certainly still significantly better to differentiate from the rest of the market. 1 year later, he got that order anyway, okay? But let me add a couple of additional things that occurred that none of us had even anticipated. The first one was that the chains, after seeing this product, then talked to some of the big suppliers and said, we want that same quality replicated by you. So he was able then to provide on an intellectual property basis, a licensing basis, the use of that technology to his competitors. So he now created a new licensing income stream. And the second thing was that because he started building a relationship with them, he was also able to gain around 30% reduction in input costs because they were able to buy big lots that he could buy off the back of. So not only did we retain the brand and the quality, we increased the revenue streams and we also decreased our operating costs. The last two weren't evident to us, but they were really critical. Okay, so the last one I want to just share with you is a very quick one, and that is Frito-Lay in the UK. Just to show you how thinking about a company through your brand lens and through how every department can affect it is critical. They had an operations issue with the amount of steam just coming off the frying line, and therefore the loss of water or the amount of usage of water that was required to offset that. And the bottom line was that they then developed this technology, a canopy that took up the steam and reconstituted a portion of that into water, saving water, etc. And at that point, it was no more than, and they're very open with this, it was no more than an operational decision. When it was starting to put through the lens of building reputational value, this was also at a time when there was an emergence of environmental sustainability, etc., and they started working and showing the market some of the things that were mentioned earlier, exposing some of the other things that the company does beyond the products that are driving the emotions of the market. They lifted their market share in a 6-month window by about 7%. Big player against big player. That is a significant shift of market share, percentage points market share. Just on the back of that, if they did not think it, clearly they weren't thinking of it, but had they been thinking about that as wrapping a brand lens around as a company, they would have identified that a lot sooner and leveraged it a lot sooner than what they did. Okay? They stumbled on it. So I'm saying let's not stumble on these things. Let's make it a deliberate strategy to work through and understand. And the way very quickly this works is that you get your teams of people together, you ask them to answer 3 questions. If our brand is going to be innovative, let's just stay with that one. I want each department of the business to help think about what are we currently doing that's innovative. Therefore, let's leverage asset value that we've already got rather than trying to buy more and more. Secondly, what should we stop doing that undermines it? Discounting, those sorts of things that occur. If I went back to that graph I showed you, the shareholder loss on strategic issues that I didn't quite finish, I'm sorry, was based on mainly on branding related issues that were already mentioned earlier. Things like discounting, going to price discounting, stop spend on marketing, going to channels of distribution that don't relate to our company brand. They are things that feel very good at the time because they give you extra value at the time, but like brands take time to grow, they also die by stealth. And there are Kodak was a great example of that proposition. So get your people involved in understanding and describing to you the activities they undertake that they believe could drive innovation harder. They'll know it better than you know it. And the executive doesn't do all that, but the team can do that. And then suddenly you're embedding the brand way of thinking culturally through your organisation. That's how you get commitment. You don't just get commitment by saying, our brand's fantastic, here's the new version of it, and you're all disciples of my brand. You've got to make that happen. And so I originally had more on my presentation, but I'll do this very quickly, and I cut this back because the discussion around trends, and we've heard some really good information today, I just want to share with you, and I tied trends to relevance, to the point of relevance. But let me just share some filters with you that I use with clients to give this a bit of a structure. One of the questions that was posed earlier was, what information is the most important? What do I start with? There's so much I could be using and utilising, and it's a great question. And so we break it down into these 5 shift filter categories, and any trend or any shift that's occurring in a market will fit one of these 5. And I think in the food industry, number 5 would be very, very obvious to everybody. But we've had discussions, as Catherine said on stage earlier, where will technology go from here? How will food operate with technology? So if you take all the pieces of information that you're gathering, put them into a framework that breaks them down. So societal trends are things such as people being time poor. If you look at being time poor, what is your company strategy for customer engagement, for customer experience? How many touch points does the customer have with your company? And it won't just be with the product, it will be in accounts, it'll be a whole lot of other things. And do we back out friction? Are we awesome to deal with? Are we the brand they want to call by name? So anything you think, market shifts, I just want to touch on very quickly. We often think of, which are competitive shifts, we often think about that as our direct competitors. But what the chains are doing, how many new chains are coming, how many new stores are being opened, how some independents are hiving off from other independents are all part of the market shifts, the competitive shifts that change what we can and can't do. So I've tried to cram in a lot in a very, very short space of time here, guys. I hope I've done it some justice. And there's been a lot of talk today about rethink things. And ironically, the slide I wanted to finish with was, once the mind has been stretched, it never returns to its original shape. And I can assure you that if you take this proposition with gusto, you will find so many things in your company that can drive value and drive that reputational value that I suspect many businesses, from my own experience, are not even looking at right now. It gives you something you can do right now. And therefore, time for questions. Oh, sorry. Whereabouts is it? The question is, fantastic question. Do you need to get your culture right before your brand can grow? If I go back to commitment, I use the word culture. Absolutely you do. Because I've seen businesses in this sector where they're investing in capital thinking that that's going to solve their problem. And when you walk in the business, you just sense the culture isn't strong. And so, I can remember a case study, Mitsubishi Motors, when they were here, they couldn't understand why tools were going missing, and they checked everyone with security, couldn't find anything, then realised that people were welding spanners to the inside of panels because they had it working there. Absolutely. But commitment, and when you start talking to people and ask your team to ask them to think about what they can do to improve, that's when the culture starts to happen. It doesn't happen just by telling people. That's it. I'll have to stop there. Thank you.
We have a round of applause, please, for the lovely Marc. Well done, Marc.
Thank you.
Elbow bump to you, my friend.